Hi, my name is Christine Meutzer. I am the manager of the Nanaimo Archives, and I'm also on the program committee of the Nanaimo Historical Society. Today I am also your host for this tour of the Wellington Cemetery. For the Nanaimo Historical Society, the whole idea of going online is new to us, and we hope that you will bear with us as we fumble maybe a little bit our way through it. This is the second of three programs that we have organized for this fall. The next one is in November, so watch our Facebook page for details of that talk. The first question we're going to ask ourselves is, where are we? It is the number one question I get when I say I'm going over or doing research on the Wellington Cemetery. So let me show you. Over that direction is Wellington Road, and just beyond that, Long Lake. And in that direction, maybe a half a mile, is Slag Lumber on Jordan Road. So that gives you a general idea of where we are. It is tucked away, but we do have to remember that when it was first started, it was quite a ways from the original Wellington town site, like all rural cemeteries were. So let's start with a little history of Wellington for some context. Wellington as a community was developed in the early 1870s when coal was discovered here by Robert Dunsmuir. By the 1890s, there was a population of about 1,174, according to the 1891 census. That population was different from most other places in the area. It was ethnically diverse. It had quite a large contingent, about 48 Belgians, 48 Austro-Hungarians, a number of Swedes and Finns, about 143 Chinese, and the rest would be a sort of mix of Scottish, Welsh, and British. And it also had a few Germans, and I think that's about it. The Wellington coal mines thrived throughout the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. In fact, they were some of the biggest producers in the province and rivaled Nanaimo's coal output. By the end of the 19th century, a fire in the town site and the exhaustion of the local coal seams basically marked the beginning of the end for Wellington. By 1901, there were only 400 citizens left here. Most of those people either made the move with the coal company to Extension and ultimately to Ladysmith, or they left the area altogether. Wellington remained a rural community until it was amalgamated with the city of Nanaimo in 1975. So now that we know a little bit about Wellington, let's have a look at the history of this particular little piece of land. It's about an acre. It was established, we believe, sometime in the 1870s and has an interesting chain of ownership. Initially, it was owned by the Dunsmuir family as part of their land grant. Later on, sometime in the 1910s, it was transferred to the Crown. James Dunsmuir gave it to the Crown. In the early 1920s, the Crown in turn gave it to qualified veterans of World War I as part of a settlement and distribution plan for soldiers, returned soldiers. This property was then owned by a man named William Loudon, who had it in his care till the 1960s when he gifted it to the local improvement district. In 1975, when the city amalgamated with all the outlying areas, this parcel became part of the city of Nanaimo. So let's consider a few things that are different about this cemetery. One of them is that it is divided into religious quadrants. That is something that we only see in the local area in Ladysmith, both cemeteries were laid out by the Dunsmuir family. In that corner it's Catholic, Methodist, Anglican, and where I'm standing is Presbyterian. Of course, by the 1920s, Presbyterian and Methodist had united to form the United Church, so that was no longer an issue, and it's unclear what happened after that. The cemetery has suffered a significant loss of grave markers over time. One example is James Canard. He was a 27-year-old carpenter from Huron County, Ontario. There is no grave marker here for him anywhere. The reason we know he died here is because he died in an unusual way. He was out in the Englishman River area. He had treed a bear. He had gone to a neighbor's house to ask this person to please cut down the tree with him. Somehow, in the process of cutting down the tree and holding their rifles, Canard accidentally shot himself. His rifle was discharged. There is an obituary that we found in a sort of obscure newspaper about how that happened in the inquest and the whole report of it, and it specifically states he was interred in the Wellington Cemetery. He may have been one of the many single men that came here with no family, because his funeral was arranged by the Wellington Lodge of the Oddfellows. He had been, they knew from his papers, a member of the Oddfellows in Huron County, Ontario. So he's just one of many people that we suspect have no marker. And that could be for so many reasons. It could have been wooden and has since degraded. It could have been moved, or they may never have had one, especially if they didn't have family or didn't have a lodge or fraternal organization affiliation. There was no one to put a marker there. One of the things we can also look at is who is not buried here. For example, there are no Chinese graves that we know of. In the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the Nanaimo area Chinese were buried on Stewart Avenue in what is now the Memorial Chinese Garden. After burial, after 7 years, the bones were then shipped back to China. By the early 1920s, that no longer happened, and the Chinese cemetery on Townsite Road was established. That may have been the experience of the Chinese who worked in the Wellington coal mines. Wellington also had a very significant, relatively speaking, black community. Most of those people were from the eastern United States, and they came here, not the same group that came in the 1850s. They came a little bit later. We understand from our research that there were about 70 of them. By the time Wellington closed down in the late 19th century, most of those people had either left the community. Some had actually gone to Cumberland, which had a significant black community, and a few went on to Ladysmith. As far as we can tell, this is the only monument that makes any mention that Wellington was a coal mining community. There is a dedication on here to John McMillan, who accidentally died in number 5 in 1893. What's really striking is the lack of monuments to coal miners. In 1888, over 70 men died in a giant explosion in the number 5 shaft. You wouldn't know it from looking around here. There seems to be no memorials. However, it could be the case that those memorials have long since disappeared. Under this rosebush is the amazing story of Reverend Colin Campbell Brown. The only reason that we know there is anybody under here is because we have a map from 1977 that says Campbell Brown. We then proceeded to do some research and find out who he was. Colin Brown came to Wellington via China with his wife. They were both missionaries there. While there, or shortly after he came back, he wrote a book, The Children of China. which to this day, most recently reprinted in 2015, is a standard scholarly work on China in the 19th century. So Colin Brown, how did he end up here in Wellington? It's an unusual story as told by his son Hugh in a recording that was done in 1980. Colin Brown came here in 1923. He came for the specific reason, as a Presbyterian minister, because there had been someone here before him who apparently, according to his son Hugh, gave false credentials and wasn't really a Presbyterian minister at all. By the end of that person's first year, a number of local women were pregnant, young local women. He was supposedly run out of town, and that's when they called Hugh's father in. It turned out that the false Presbyterian minister was really a taxi driver from New York, or so the story goes. Meanwhile, Colin Campbell Brown came here and tried to make amends to the community. He did go around ministering. No one would answer the door to him. It took him at least 6 months to sort of get people to feel comfortable with him and trust him. He then went to Vancouver after he'd been here for about a year, and he died. So distraught was the community that a group of them went over to Vancouver to bring him back here, even though he had come earlier from a home in Vernon and the rest of his family wasn't here. The miners wanted to pay their respects, so they formed a committee and raised the money to produce a quite elaborate granite and marble monument which stood on this site. Unfortunately, again according to Colin Brown's son Hugh, it was here in the 60s and 70s, but when his wife and himself came to visit in 1980, it was no longer there. Unfortunate, because this is an incredibly interesting story that Colin Campbell Brown, whose book still is read and purchased, rests here in Wellington. Who knew? Also buried underneath this overgrown bush are the Cork Girls, Selena and Phoebe. We think they died in the mid-1890s, but we have not been able to locate birth or death certificates for either of them. Their parents were George and Mary Ann Cork, and in total the Corks had 6 daughters. One of them ended up staying here, got married and stayed here. The other 3 married and went to other parts of the province. The only reason we know about the Cork Girls is that underneath this bush on the curbing is their name. This is the final resting place of George and Mary Dunbar. The Dunbars, we believe, had at least 10 children. We can first track George in Nanaimo when he was the proprietor of the Italian Hotel, which some people might remember as the Columbus Hotel on Halliburton. Then it was the Jolly Miner, and I believe now it is abandoned. Nonetheless, that was his job in the 1890s. Sometime after that, he moved to Wellington and became a farmer. It's very possible with all those children and so many missing headstones and so little information that some of those children may in fact be buried here too. Somewhere in this area is the burial site of Matt Ahamka, a Finnish man that we know was buried here from the 1977 headstone map. We know very little about him. We do know that we were able to find on a Finnish genealogy site that his sisters were also here, and they married into the Salmi and Hill families in the Yellow Point area. Matt himself did not die in a mining accident as far as we know, and we can find no other evidence of his life here. What we can say about that is that anytime it's an ethnic name, anything that's basically not Anglo-Saxon often gets misspelled in the official record, thereby almost impossible to find. We do know he was here. We don't know what happened to his headstone. In this cemetery, what we usually face is a body that we're almost positive was buried here and no headstone. This is the reverse. In this case, we have a headstone for a William Donner that does not show up on the map or on any other record we have. So it bears further research, and it's the one time that we've been able to find an exception to our otherwise no headstone rule. So why is this important? Why is it important that we know and understand this cemetery? Well, the most obvious thing is that all burial grounds have cultural, spiritual, or religious significance, and the Wellington Cemetery, of course, would be no exception. The other thing is that you can read the cemetery as a reflection, a sort of condensed version of the history of the community. It's small, like the town was small. It came and went, like the town came and went. And it has a certain feeling to it that you don't get anywhere else in this area, because in fact it is one of the very few remains, physical remains of that community. It also functions as an outdoor learning lab for children, for adults, or for anybody who just likes to learn history. So for all those reasons, it's important to know what's in your neighborhood, to know what's in your city, and how those cemeteries reflect our local history. We are hoping as a society to be able to do some cleanup work here, to perhaps identify additional people, to just know more. So we'll keep you posted on how that project goes. We are working with the city right now, and we'll let you know through Facebook or through this YouTube channel. Thank you so much.